On this video, I am continuing to look at Christ in the Old Testament, seen through New Testament lenses. In 2 Samuel chapter 7, we have one of the three great Matterhorn covenants of the Old Testament, the Davidic covenant. We find this in 2 Samuel 7:12 through 14. In this text, we are told that one would reign on David's throne forever. And what is striking in Psalm 110, verse 1, it is repeated. The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies the footstool of your feet. And as we look at the New Testament, that text, along with the Davidic covenant, was applied to Christ. We see this, for example, spoken by Gabriel concerning its fulfillment in Luke 1:32 to 33. Gabriel announces that the child being born would reign on David's throne forever. So those passages, along with Acts 2:32 to 36, and Hebrews 1:5 and 13, all talk about how Christ fulfills the Davidic covenant. He reigns on David's throne. Then we have another passage, and that is in the Psalms. There's a number of passages where we see Christ pointing to Christ in the New Testament. In Psalm 2, it reads, why do the nations rage and the peoples meditate a vain thing? The kings of the earth station themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed one. It is interesting that in Acts 4:13, this very text is applied to Christ and his work upon the cross, where the enemies were raging around the cross. And we find this talked about in Acts chapter 4. Then we also have the phrase in Psalm 2, this day have I begotten you. And I believe when we look in the New Testament that this is the coronation of Christ in New Testament application, while it was looking at an Israeli king in its first level in Acts 13, verses 33 to 37. Paul applies that text to the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So the resurrection of Christ was his coronation day, according to New Testament teaching and New Testament lenses. Then we have Psalm 8. Psalm 8 is another reference to Christ in that looking at mankind, it says you've made him a little lower than the angels, and you've crowned him with glory and honor. It is interesting in that text in verses 6 to 9, we see how that becomes a type of Christ. In the New Testament, especially in Hebrews chapter 2, verses 5 to 9, Christ was made a little lower than the angels in the incarnation. And now he is crowned with glory and honor above them. Furthermore, in Acts 16, there is a reference where the psalmist speaks and says, you will not leave my soul in Sheol, in Psalm 16. Again, this is a messianic typical application to Christ in the resurrection. And we see it fulfilled in Acts 2:22 to 36, where the Lord would not leave Christ in the grave, that he has resurrected and he's alive. In Psalm 22, we also have the prayer of Christ, we might call it upon the cross. And we begin with, my God, why have you forsaken me? And we see this fulfilled in Matthew 27:46, where Christ cries out the same words. And so, really, Psalm 22 is a type of Calvary. There are the enemies raging against the psalmist, mocking him. And when we look at the New Testament, how this is amazingly applied to Christ in Matthew 27 and John 19. Also, it says that in Psalm 22, there was thirst. The psalmist says, I'm thirsty. But it's interesting in John 19:28, and that's in Psalm 22:16. We see how Jesus on the cross said, I thirst. It's also interesting, the angry crowd around the cross, I think, is seen with the crowd opposing the coronation, or opposing, I should say, the psalmist and what he was going through, David, for example. But its final fulfillment is the crowd around the cross, mocking and jeering at the Lord. There's also the division of garments in Psalm 22, verse 19, and how that is applied to Christ in John 19:24. And then we see the resurrection. I will declare your name among the brethren. In the midst of the assembly, I will praise you. And in the New Testament, that is applied to the resurrection in Hebrews chapter 2, 10-18. In Psalm 40, there is the statement, sacrifice and offerings I don't want, but a body you prepared for me. And in Hebrews chapter 10, that is applied to Christ in New Testament lenses, looking at Christ's willing sacrifice and how the Lord prepared him for that. In Psalm 45, the psalmist, it reads, your throne, O God, is forever and ever. And again, these very words are applied to the eternality and deity of our Lord Jesus Christ. An earthly king did not fulfill that in its fullest way, but Jesus does in Hebrews 1:7-12. It's also interesting in Psalm 68, we're told that Jesus in the New Testament led captivity captive when he ascended to the Father. And in Psalm 68, verse 19, the psalmist is talking about the Lord coming and leading captivity captive and giving Israel victory, and then is pouring out that victory to them in the spoils. In the New Testament, this is applied to Christ in the incarnation and the spiritual victory that was effected in the resurrection in Ephesians 4:7-12. In Psalm 89, there is a kingdom promised to David. It's a great psalm. And how, again, this is fulfilled and applied to Christ, we see in Matthew, especially chapters 1 of Matthew, verses 1-7, where Christ again fulfills that Davidic covenant promise. In Psalm 102, it speaks of your years fail not. The psalmist is praying concerning the years of Yahweh that last forever. The eternality of that, though, of Yahweh is applied directly to Christ in Hebrews chapter 1, verses 10-12, when it reads, your years fail not, Lord, speaking of Jesus in the New Testament. Psalm 110, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right side until I make your enemies the footstool of your feet. Verse 1, again, in the New Testament, applied to Christ as the King resurrected. and how he will reign until he put all enemies under his feet, the last of which will be death. And then in Psalm 110, it says, you are a priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek. In Psalm 110, verse 4, it's interesting that is applied to Christ in his eternal priesthood by virtue of his resurrection in the book of Hebrews, chapter 7, verses 11 to 25. And then finally, in Psalm 118, the stone which the builders rejected has become the head of the corner, we're told, in Psalm 118, 22 to 23. This was applied by Christ to himself in Matthew 21, 33 to 44. But was speaking of, and probably historically, of Israel rejected, has now become an application, or is applied to Christ in the New Testament as the final Israel, rejected, but becoming the head of the corner, rejected by the religious leaders at that time, but becoming the head of the church. So this is just a quick resume of some of the passages that point to Christ through New Testament lenses from Samuel and also the Psalms.